If you decided to click on this installment of Unsung Heroes, I first of all want to thank you for doing that, because it's certainly not the most exciting looking of cars, the Tango T600, but for those of you who are long-term fans of the series, chances are you know that if it's here, there's a reason why. And trust me on that, it's a pretty good reason why, because there's a lot more to the T600 than meets the eye. See, the idea for this car actually originates in the 1980s from a guy called Rick Woodbury. Now, Rick and his son Brian ultimately founded a brand called Commuter Cars in 1998 to produce this vehicle. But his idea back in the 80s was based around a simple concept. It was essentially the precursor to what would become something like a smart car, because Rick had the idea that if millions upon millions of Americans were travelling to work alone, why not save all of that metal and space and fuel and make something which takes up half the lane size and maybe even only seats a single person, but with cutting-edge tech. Now, originally, he was planning to use hydrogen technology, but it wasn't really at the point where he could fully try it, so he waited a little bit longer, and ultimately he went with electric, which was probably the better choice in terms of development. Now, what he could have easily done was fitted this with essentially the equivalent of a gee-whiz kind of spec, something which is barely even a car, perhaps even learner legal or technically a scooter, for instance, with no reverse gear and all that kind of nonsense. But no, he actually went all in and really did go above and beyond, because this thing is an absolute hot rod. Now, the car is fairly tall, as you can see, and you'd probably be thinking, is it safe? Because it's not that wide, it's reasonably long in comparison to its length anyway, but it's very, very tall, and it certainly doesn't look stable. It essentially looks like a mobility scooter with a body shell. So how on earth could that ever be a good idea? Well, actually, it's a pretty genius idea, because the entire centre of gravity for this car is located just 11 inches above the ground, which can easily rival many sports cars. You can even find footage of this car doing slalom tests and emergency swerves online, and in fact, at the time, it broke the record in the States for the fastest speed it took that emergency swerve at successfully. You can park this car on a 30% incline sideways and it will not tip over because its centre of gravity is so low. This is not just a city car. It's essentially a sports car that happens to be in a weird looking body. Because hiding under that, albeit very weird looking exterior, is actually a beast of a car, because this thing has either 2 or 4 motors, driving of course all 4 wheels in that latter form, and it puts out 800 brake horsepower and 1,000 foot-pounds of torque. So it's rather quick. It has direct drive gearing, but you can actually swap some of the gearing out to improve the top speed, even though, for understandable reasons, most of the time customers won't do that. Now, the 0 to 60 on this is 3.2 seconds. That's faster than a Tesla before a Tesla was even a thing. The top speed is 150 miles an hour. And with that longer gearing setup, it could even do 172 miles an hour. Now, of course, the limiting factor with almost all electric cars, even up till this day in 2021, is battery technology, and that was even more so the case with this one, because back in 2005 they planned to make 100 of these a year, and they actually delivered their first vehicle in 2005, August, to none other than George Clooney, of all people. However, because of 2 primary factors, they've never really sold that many cars. Now, one of the factors is obvious. The looks. They're not for everyone, it's very simple, it looks very kit car-esque, and the price is the second one, because it is very, very prohibitive for many people, because the technology put into it, the cost of the batteries and the development and the parts, is simply high. It is in the vast majority of vehicles, especially for a tiny company who at their peak only had 8 workers at the same time at any given time, in which period they could actually put out 1 car a month. Now, to date, according to their own website, they've produced 12 cars in total, which is actually not bad for a company like this, but of course, being a $120,000 car would certainly put some people off. One of the great things about small companies like this, though, is that they tend to have a lot of love and passion put into it, and that is definitely the case here. Rick himself, for example, sold his own boat to help fund building the cars, and virtually all of the profit that the company makes goes back into making more cars. The problem is, nobody is wanting to buy a mass production run of these because, again, why would a larger company ever need to? They could just do it themselves. And for one-to-one customers, well, again, it's a very specialized car that not everyone wants. Now, on the subject of the most limiting factor, which, as I said, is battery technology, this car was actually available with two forms. You could have a more conventional battery setup or lithium-ion, and the range difference, of course, is pretty massive. With regular batteries, you're looking at about 40 to 60 miles, which is fine in a city, but not really. If you want to go more upmarket and get the lithium-ion, it extends the range to actually a very respectable 150 miles. Now, as far as electric cars go, this is actually technically one of the lightest weight electric production cars ever. If you want to count it as a production car anyway, which it technically kind of is, because it weighs 1,400 kilos. Now, to put that into perspective, that's almost the same as something like an Audi S3. So, for the way the car looks, it's very heavy, but again, you've got to remember, it's got all the batteries in there. That's about 3,000 pounds. But that weight being so low, as I mentioned earlier on, is also part of why it's so stable. If it was ultra lightweight, it simply wouldn't be. Now, part of the reason why it's so expensive is because the parts and effort and technology that they put into the car is actually really high standards. The body is carbon fiber. The chassis is stainless steel. It has the hubs and calipers from Mazda, the MX-5 in particular. It has a Momo steering wheel, Sparco seats, and NASCAR-grade roll cage. The steering column is from Cadillac. It has all of these components put together which originally were planned to be sourced and manufactured in-house, but they very quickly found that those costs would be prohibitively high on what was already going to be a very expensive car. So even with all of this outsourcing, albeit of, in many cases, quality parts, it was still an expensive product at the end of the day, and a lot of that, as with most electric cars, is the batteries. And if even in 2021 that's still the problem, imagine how much of a problem it was back in 2005 and even earlier when they were developing that first car. Now, in terms of the performance, I already talked about the 0 to 60, I talked about the top speed, but even the quarter mile on this thing is absolutely crazy. It actually ran a 12.2 second quarter mile at about 110 miles an hour at the Spokane Raceway, also, of course, in Washington. And that was with no special preparation. It was essentially just a road-legal car with no alterations. That's pretty crazy. Now, to speak further on that development, part of the reason why the car can actually handle itself so well is because it was sent in 2005 to ProDrive. Now, ProDrive, of course, are, you could argue, one of the best companies out there when it comes to developing a car's handling and manners, because they've been involved in a number of race cars. For instance, the Ferrari that Colin McRae drove in the Le Mans 24-hour event. Of course, they developed the ProDrive P2, which was in this same series many, many episodes ago, an incredible little unsung hero way back from an older Top Gear episode. They know what they're doing when it comes to this kind of thing. Now, incidentally, as far as the battery and the charging goes, even by the standards of 10, 15 years ago, it actually wasn't too bad. You could charge it up on a 110-volt outlet overnight, for instance. On a higher voltage and higher amps, you could get it fully charged in 3 hours, and you could get a decent amount of charge in about an hour. So again, even in comparison to something like modern Tesla technology, that's not bad at all for this tiny little family-run company. In fact, the technology was so impressive that they even entered it for the Automotive X Prize Award in 2010. Unfortunately, even though the car performed extremely well in terms of its sheer performance, it failed to complete the 100-mile test run, which again would probably depend on what batteries they were using. I'm hoping they were using the lithiums. If that was the case, then it must have failed due to reliability, but if they failed due to having the 60-mile range of regular batteries, then that would be an understandable failure. Ultimately, it's certainly a wacky little car. It's one of the craziest performance cars you can, I believe, technically still buy if you want to. Their website is still up. I'll probably even link to it in the video description below if you want to check it out. And it's certainly an unsung hero of the electric car world, that's for sure. This car in 2005, and even technically before that in its prototype form, had performance which can still rival Tesla's, Jag I-Paces, etc. to this day. The range with lithium is good. The advantages in sheer size and space are still something which no other electric company have even attempted to do. I think this car very much so has a place on the market, and I think that unfortunately, this is a classic case of looks being more important to people than substance. Just because it looks weird doesn't mean it isn't brilliant. In fact, I would say it is. Ultimately though, that's it for this installment of Unsung Heroes. Of course, if you're new to the series, be sure to check out the previous ones. There are literally hundreds of these on the channel, with some pretty other crazy cars as well. And of course, if you want to check out more, then stick around on the channel for those as well. But, of course, go over to the Discord page for this channel and vote on this car if it's one of your favourite episodes so far. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.